Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. I'm looking forward to introducing our next week on the learning module on whether or not gifted education is a right or a privilege. Like I mentioned last week, this is a challenging concept because most of us, hopefully, as educators, want the best for all of our students. So clearly, we want all of our students to have the same learning opportunities that the Torelos, depending upon how you pronounce their name, have the opportunity for their students. But as we look into the laws that go into gifted education and a lot of disparity across states and also across districts and even schools, we recognize that this is a much more complicated question than it may seem to be. So before we dig into our content for this coming week, I'd like to talk through a couple of things on your discussion posts. Several of you quoted um, the excerpt that said gifted programs are not a bonus or a perk or reward for the smart kids. This is really important for us to know because that is a common misunderstanding within the education world, that students who are, quote, smart get placed into these gifted services, and really what that is extra opportunities and more, oftentimes I've even heard it said, fun things for them to do. What we really want to shift the attitude toward is that gifted education services are necessary for gifted students to reach their full potential. Just like we have an IEP for students who may have a visual impairment, they require different services in order for them to learn to their fullest potential. In the same way, students who are gifted really need differentiated services in order to, number one, address their unique social and emotional needs and strengths, but also for them to reach their fullest potential academically. I was happy to see several of you mention the fact that we have a lot of risk factors for students who are identified as gifted. Things like underachievement are far too common. Some of our brightest students are earning some of our worst grades, and that's because they're simply not challenged appropriately in the classroom. In terms of who is held responsible for gifted education, a lot of you mentioned, well, it's kind of everyone. So it's a mixture of the general education teacher, the school, the administration, even the parents, some of you mentioned. And idealistically, I would say I agree. But let's think about all of the issues there. Number one, remember that myth and reality surveys that you took at the beginning of our semester? Most of us, and this is not a bad thing, it's just what happens, we are operating under misunderstandings of what it means to be gifted. So, if we're operating under, for example, the misunderstanding that gifted students are well behaved, and I'm taking on, as a general education teacher who may not be trained, the responsibility for those students, it may be that I hold this implicit bias that gifted students are always well behaved, and therefore I'm super strict and not nurturing towards those students, which can actually do them a disservice. Same thing goes for like counseling needs. We often believe, well, gifted students have everything together, so they don't need our support, where actually quite the opposite is true. So while I do agree that everyone is responsible, we have to counter that with the lack of training that we have in gifted education, even within our own field. So several educators and teachers, as you saw in that State of the Nation address for 2014 to 2015, very few states require that teachers take even one class on gifted education, which means that they are operating under oftentimes misunderstandings about what it means to be gifted as they're serving those students in their classroom. So many of you mentioned without an official program, that responsibility would lie on the teacher. Again, we need to consider training and also the support of the administration and the staff in that. Hannah mentioned that oftentimes, in terms of accountability, schools are focused on bringing the bottom up, right? So, what we often hear about in education is this achievement gap, which, yes, is a very important issue and is all about how do I get my students who are down here to rise farther up and to improve. But what you may not know is we also have an excellence gap. So the excellence gap is referring to, and we'll get more to this later with invisible gifted, but the excellent gap is really about we have students who are gifted, but they're not identified. Several of these students are from culturally diverse populations, and oftentimes they don't fit our assumption of what gifted students act like and look like. So that again points to the importance of training. Courtney and several others brought up the very important factor that we have very little accountability. So one thing that I want you guys to be careful of when you're reading things like the South Carolina Manual for Gifted Education, just because it says something doesn't mean we're doing something. And this is very common in gifted education. We often have these statements of, this is what gifted education is in South Carolina, but are we actually carrying out those statements into the field? And even more importantly, are we holding ourselves accountable? So the thing that most concerns me when I read this report that I gave you all is the lack of accountability. So we're saying we need all these programs to be put in place, but we're not actually examining whether or not those programs are effective or if they even exist. So it's definitely an issue because we're oftentimes in gifted education saying one thing but meaning the next. So unfortunately, this question and these discussion posts don't have a quick and easy answer. Of course, we would all like to say all students have the right to education that is tailored to their unique strengths and their unique needs. Of course we would. We're teachers. We love our students. But when we look at the law, we have to realize that there's very little in place to truly advocate for our students in terms of legality. So since gifted education is so based at the state level, there's a lot of disparity there, not only in what services are provided, but also in what it means to be gifted. So I have worked with students who were gifted in one state, moved, and were no longer gifted, which has a tremendous social emotional impact on those students. So it is important that we keep this in mind in terms of reading publications, guys, does not always mean it's the truth. We have to always contradict what does this manual say with what's actually happening in our schools. And when we look at the fact that there's no standardized measurement of accountability, that worries me because oftentimes schools and states are saying we do one thing, but we're really doing something very different. One of you ended your post quite poignantly and said, well, we love these students. What can we do to change all of this? And I loved that because you guys as a class are doing well, not containing what we call a deficit perspective. So yes, there are issues. Yes, there are struggles and things that are not good. But what's wonderful is that you're looking at this, in my opinion, in more of a dynamic perspective, meaning you're looking for what's good and what can we change. So in terms of what do we do next, yes, I wish that we had more money. Of course, I wish we had more funding for gifted education. And yes, I wish that we had more accountability. And yes, I wish that we had more teacher training. All of those things. But in terms of what can I do tomorrow morning? What can I do when I walk into my school on Monday? What I am so passionate about is that we are advocating for our students. So many people do not even know that giftedness exists. And these aren't just people on the streets, guys. These are like some of my colleagues at different universities who don't work in education have never even heard the term gifted. So it really is our responsibility as educators, particularly being trained in gifted education, to spread the word about what does it truly mean to be gifted. And as we spread that word, we're able to advocate for their students and help others realize that we're not truly serving all of these students the way that we should be. So that's a really great lead in to this week's assignment. So last week I mentioned that I was going to have you write a gifted education philosophy statement. And after doing some thinking and also reading your discussion posts, I'm going to change that to a different assignment that I've also done in the past. And your assignment is to create, for lack of better terms, a flyer for giftedness. Like, what does it really mean to be gifted and why this actually matters? Think about walking through hallways and you see posters and flyers. They're trying to advertise something by catching your attention and pointing to what's most important. And as we think about the need to advocate for our students who are gifted and talented, I think it makes the most sense for us to put that into practice. So I want you to think about your very personal environment right now. Are you working in a school? Maybe you're doing your internship, you're doing some field work. It may be that you are also working with children in another situation who may be gifted or maybe around others who are gifted. So your challenge is to create a flyer that advertises what is giftedness. If you look into your Blackboard page, you'll see that this would include 4 things. Okay, so number 1, who are these gifted students? What does giftedness mean? Number 2, what are some common gifts or myths rather about being gifted? Number 3, do gifted students really require differentiated services? And lastly, how can various individuals, teachers, parents, administrators support these gifted students? Your goal here is to spread the word, advocate for your students, and help others realize that they are unique and they do require differentiated services. So again, 4 components. The first, who are the gifted? Number 2, what are some common myths about the gifted? Number 3, do they really require differentiated services? And lastly, how can various individuals support these students? So as usual, I'll be looking for your posts by Sunday evening. It is very important that you write these in an informed manner. You do not have to quote your sources, but think about your population. If you think your audience would be more convinced by quoting your research that's backing everything, then please do so. I am looking for you to write an informed response, but you are not required to necessarily quote them unless you think that is appropriate. As always, please feel free to email me or come by with any questions, and I hope you have a wonderful week.